Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Natalie Smith and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I work on the individual giving and special events team here at TCG. And just to provide a bit of a visual description of me, I am a young white cis woman seated wearing large round glasses, a light pink top with a floral pattern on it. And I have the background of our fabulous fall forum behind me. Just wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction to this space today. We're so grateful that you all joined us. This session does have closed captioning available. You can access that along the bottom of your screen or message myself or my colleague Shauna for additional information. I'm here to support the Zoom logistics today. So if you have any Zoom trouble or any questions about Zoom or the larger session, please feel free to message me privately. I'll also keep an eye on the chat and the raised hand function and track things over there as well. Just a reminder to please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking today. And we will use both the chat and the raise hand function. So feel free to have those at your disposal as well. A note too that this session is being recorded, but you won't be recorded when you're in breakout sessions. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful Executive Director, Teresa Eyring.
Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. Teresa Eyring, Executive Director and CEO of TCG. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a white woman sitting in New York City where it just started raining. I'm wearing a blue suit and I'm sitting in front of the Fall Forum famous, infamous, amazing background that says a just and thriving theater ecology. This session is focusing on the demands as related to staff and board recruitment. And we're fortunate to have with us today Al Hartley and Leandro Zanetti of ALJP Consulting, a relatively new executive search firm in the landscape of executive search. And I would just want to introduce our speakers. Al Hartley is a principal at ALJP Consulting. In addition to his consulting work, Al is the managing director of the Wirt Center for the Performing Arts at Northwestern University. He's a Yale School of Drama grad and has worked for various regional theaters across the country, including the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, Yale Repertory Theater, the Guthrie Theater, Cleveland Playhouse, and Steppenwolf Theater Company. He currently serves on the boards of the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network and the Yale Summer Cabaret. Leandro A. Zanetti is an associate at ALJP Consulting. He's a Brazilian-American creative producer focused on developing and producing live performance by and for people of color. He's a co-founder of Codify Art, a Brooklyn-based multidisciplinary artist collective foregrounding the work of queer and trans artists of color. He has previously worked at various organizations, including the New Group, the Public Theater, Steppenwolf Theater Company, Yale Repertory Theater, and the digital marketing consulting company Capacity Interactive. Leandro is a graduate of the Yale School of Drama and Brown University. We are focusing this session on 3 specific demands, but as you know, there are many more than 3 demands that address hiring and board recruitment. And as you may have noticed, these demands for the most part are not focused on quotas or transactional processes, but rather the values and practices that are or should be bedrock within theater organizations and their boards. With our time today, Al and Leandro are going to talk a bit about their experience and philosophy in conducting searches for both executive and senior level positions. They will also guide us through some deep thinking around a few principles that undergird successful searches, whether related to paid staff or volunteer boards. With that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Al.
Thank you for that, Teresa, and good afternoon, everyone. Just to give also a visual description of myself, I am a young cis Black man who is bald-headed, with plenty of beard, as well as wearing a red checkered shirt and sitting in front of a lovely corkboard with some memorabilia there, but also filing cabinet. And really thrilled and pleased to be speaking with you all today and to see so many people who I have interacted in my career with and who have guided my career, and then of course, folks that I have not met yet, but really looking forward and really thrilled to interact with you this afternoon. As Teresa mentioned, I'm a co-founder and principal at ALJP Consulting, as well as running a performing arts center based at a university. And our firm, ALJP Consulting, has been around only for a little over a year. And where we come from and talk about in terms of how we began this firm and this thinking and entry into the executive search space is nothing particularly special other than, frankly, myself and my co-founder and partner, Jocelyn Prince, thinking about and thinking through how the hiring process has operated for us as Black people within the theater field and the industry, as well as how hiring processes have operated for us, both in terms of people who have hired other people, but also people who have been hired. And really trying to look at the ecology of our theater field as a whole, and consider, what is a way and what is a way to practice in terms of actually looking at equity and anti-racism as well as art at the center of what we're trying to do. And, I have no aspersions or lack of knowledge around the fact that there are many, many firms who do work that is, similar to us and have preceded us in terms of this space. So our newness is mostly a product of, one, us being a majority and currently all BIPOC firm, but also, two, trying to consider and trying to look at not only the We See You White American theater demands, but ask for there to be a different perspective in terms of what the hiring process can look like for candidates, how we enter and work with candidates, from a broad spectrum and a diverse pool of people in terms of engaging with arts institutions and performing art institutions, as well as how we seek to, frankly, enact change and moving the field forward in terms of some of these demands that have been articulated, but also in terms of what we've seen from our BIPOC colleagues over the several years that we have been a part of this field. And that there is a passion, if not an urgent need, for not only finding and recruiting talent within our sector, but also trying to find and recruit talent both outside of our sector and retaining that talent within our regional theater field. That ultimately, in terms of our philosophy or looking at our philosophy, is that we do ask a very simple question: who is not at your table? Who is not around you that not only informs the work of your institution, but also informs the network and people that we are connected to in terms of hiring and in terms of networking? And I fully admit my own biases and privileges that you all may have even heard in my own biography, that I've worked for several regional theaters, that I did go to Yale for an MFA in theater management, and that, as I mentioned at the top of this talk, that there are many people that I do recognize within this room, and of course others that I don't. But even using my experience as a Black man working in the theater field, especially around management, is also a testament to some of the privileges as well as institutional barriers that people without the same access may not be able to get through and or break through. The fact that I started my career as an intern at Steppenwolf and a fellow at Steppenwolf, and that my father could frankly afford for me to take a summer where he had to spend upwards of $7,000 to $8,000 for me to live in Chicago and to work with a theater company. But that was the way in which I knew and that I perceived to get into the regional theater system and thus follow into a pipeline of aiming towards leadership. Understanding the time and the resources that it does take to build up a network, to get to know, quote unquote, the right people, and actually be able to advance your own cause and your own career. And so I use that also as a case study and as an example of not necessarily per se a success, but also to say, what are those challenges and pieces that we often do overlook, in my view, around hiring and recruitment of candidates? Where do we have spots that we cannot see and that we do not see often because we are surrounded either by people who look similar to us and or do not have the time or the resources to look outward. And so that's where ideally our work is coming in to just help within this space and to be a different voice within this space. And that we have opinions about how different searches and things can be run. But today, what we want to do with you and with my colleague Leandro is to really dive deep into some of these questions or some of these pieces in the demands, in particular around the ideas of transparency. And that I know that many organizations and many theaters and many people struggle with, what does a transparent process truly look like? How do we uphold the values of equity and transparency while also, frankly, being able to protect both the institutions as well as the candidates that are applying for those positions? What are the ways in which we can operationalize transparency to not only apply to our searches and our recruitment efforts, but also apply to how we operate within our organizations, working with staff, board, and community stakeholders? And that ultimately for us, it is considering who is not at that table and beginning from that perspective of trying to understand on our end, what do the people who are not at the table need to know about this organization, need to know about this process, need to know about this industry? How do we break down the barriers to encourage people to work within our sector, bring knowledge and bring innovation into our work, so that we can continue to have an advancing field ecology overall? And so I'm thrilled to be able to work with you all today. I'm thrilled to be able to engage in some chat conversations, as well as hopefully some conversations via the Zoom platform, and to hear your thoughts and to hear some of your challenges and recommendations around this idea of transparency, as well as other pieces of the demands for us to discuss. No one is here, and I am not here certainly expecting any kind of right answer about this. Even the purpose of our firm is to try to help come up with different ideas and right answers for this critically important question. It's not everything that we will solve today. And frankly, it's not everything that our firm or multiple different firms can solve alone. We have to solve this question together. And that's part of what we are aiming at and where we are as a company. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Leandro, to talk through some of our first solo and deep dive work for the session. Then we're going to move into some breakout groups and come back and have both a facilitated discussion and conversation about some of these ideas around transparency. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leandro.
Hi, folks. My name is Leandro. A quick visual description. I am a cis Latino man who is wearing a large set of headphones over the ears, gray round glasses. I am also a bald man. with a beard. I am wearing a blue shirt, and I'm sitting in my bedroom in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. So I echo everything that Al just said, and I'm excited to talk to you all. And the first part of what we wanted to talk about is related to the 3 demands that were specifically highlighted for this section. And those demands were, the first one was that that organizations conduct transparent hiring practices, including clear salary recommendations for posting throughout the entire organization, particularly executive leadership and junior to mid-level positions. 2, we demand that the theater's highest paid executive staff member make no more than 10 times the yearly salary of the lowest paid full-time staff member. And 3, we demand divestment from bloated executive packages and bonuses. So those were sort of the 3 that were originally pulled out for this section. And as we were planning and organizing this, this discussion with y'all, one of the things that we kept honing back in on was this first demand that that companies conduct transparent hiring practices throughout the entire organization, particularly with executive leadership and junior to mid-level positions. And to focus a little bit even further in on that, to talk about what does it mean to conduct a transparent hiring practice, and what does transparency mean, and to whom and for whom? Who does that benefit? And one of the reasons that we really wanted to focus in on this concept of transparency as it relates to search is because it tends to intersect many of the characteristics of white supremacist culture that you can look at in the document by Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun, where they detail what those characteristics of white supremacy culture are. If you have not checked that out before, I'll put a link to it in the chat once I finish speaking. And some of the ways that it intersects with transparency and hoarding or transparency is via power hoarding. Who has the information has the power. Defensiveness, in that it doesn't allow people to give you feedback on your process. The idea that there's only one right way, and that's the way that you're doing it, and therefore we don't have to share what we're doing with anybody. Fear of open conflict, again, not inviting people to critique what your process might be and allow them to show you where you might have blind spots. Objectivity, the idea that objectivity is real in any way, that we are not all just subjective creatures. And right to comfort, right, which is talked about in Right to Comfort for Executive Leadership. And whose comfort are we prioritizing and not being transparent? So all of those things have led us to really want to drill down on the idea of what does transparency mean? And then what does it look like as it relates to search specifically? And then how can we start to take each of our individual definitions of transparency into a group setting and allow our definitions of transparency to build a process that is more transparent overall for all people involved. So the first thing that we would like everyone to do is we'd like you to just take 10 minutes on your own and spend a little bit of time crafting a working definition of transparency for yourself as it relates to hiring or recruitment. And a few things that we'll push y'all to do or invite y'all to do is that your definition should include who needs to feel that it is transparent? Like, at what point do you know when it is transparent? And what would you need in order for it to be feel transparent? So what would you need to be true? How would transparency be defined as it relates to search? And we'll give you about 10 minutes to take that. We'll come back and we'll do a group discussion once those 10 minutes are up. I'll give you a 2-minute warning once we're at that point.
If anybody needs a reference, there in the chat, I put the specific prompt and questions from Leandro.
All right, so we are back. Thank you for going through that with us. We've got some people starting to chat through on what their articulation of their definition for transparency is. And so I just want to ask, what was challenging for you about that prompt, if anything? And you can feel free to use the raise hand function, and we can start a discussion there. What was challenging about that prompt for you? Davior.
Yeah, thanks. Daviar Snipes here. He, him, the Alliance Theater. And I think it was, honestly, it was the word transparency in regards to how open am I and truthful do I be with what I want to present to those that we're trying to recruit. We know that the purpose, we know how we're trying to make EDI the cornerstone of our theater, and with that will become expectations from you as a person coming into this organization. So how much of that how do I put that into words per se, in regards to what will be demanded of you, how you will be expected to respond, and how you will be expected to interject into that. So it was really kind of grasping how big of an ask that was going to be up front for someone who we were trying to recruit.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that brings up a question of like what transparency to whom, right? And because I think we can talk about transparency within the organization for people who are not a part of the search process. How do you keep them engaged and involved and feeling like they have the information? But we also have transparency with regard to like the community, and then we have transparency with the candidates themselves. How much do you tell the candidate versus how much do you expect them to sort of know to ask, right? So I think that's one of the slippery things about transparency for sure. Anybody else want to share what was challenging about that prompt for them?
I want to lift up, while we're looking also briefly, just some of the different pieces that are also coming in from the chat as well. In particular, people talking about candidates' experience, about very material things that people should be able to see. Whether it is the job duties and descriptions, whether it is about salary, but in particular about what is that experience overarching for that candidate overall, and how to be open and when to be open about what that process looks like. At least as someone who has been hired, but also has been recruited, understanding, at least from, especially as a BIPOC person, of where is this organization in its process, and how at least I am able to interpret where I'm at in that process, can be key in terms of pieces of information. But there's a lot of great things happening in the chat about, what is this position? What is this position within the organization as well? And how do you communicate that and articulate that to a candidate as they're going through particular steps in the process, and frankly, making considerations about whether to jump in the process overall or not.
Yeah, thank you, Al. Yeah, and Teresa added in the chat as well, and I want to lift up that a lot of the things that we're talking about today we're specifically talking about a hiring process, but they can also be applied to board recruitment and like these issues of transparency. What are you recruiting for? Who gets involved in the recruitment process? I think all of these things can be transferred into board recruitment as well. So are there any questions that that prompt brought up for people? Feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand and share it with us. Are there any questions that you have sort of in your brain about transparency? Kelvin asks, where is retention in this conversation? And I think that's a really important question, Kelvin. Thank you. Which is, I think the way that we think about it is the more transparent you can be with a candidate on the front end, the more likely you are to hire someone who is easier to retain, because often retention is a challenge when people are not fully aware of what they're stepping into. Right. And when the hiring process, when the organization is not transparent with the candidate and what they're doing, and what will be expected of them, and what the culture of the organization currently is, even if that culture wants to be in a moment of change, being transparent about and being honest about where the organization is, I think will only help in the retention efforts. Al, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think a piece of that too, in terms of not only just transparency, but frankly, in terms of its particular executive leader searches around the idea of just even surprise, that how much are we ensuring as both people who are out there doing searches, but also for the organization, of how to eliminate, as many surprises as you can before that candidate does come in. Because what can happen, and what often happens, is that we do want to have this glowing picture of what the organization looks like and what it is doing and where is it at, without necessarily focusing very, very fluently on what are those challenges and where are those surprises going to come in for a candidate. There's a great professor over at Kellogg and Northwestern who talks about this idea of there shouldn't, in his philosophy, that there shouldn't be any surprises in life. And I think what he means by that is that if we look at the functionality of our organizations, we look at the processes within our organizations, and also consider the mental map and framing of what are the challenges and opportunities for this position and for this person specifically. Often, if we think about those questions ahead of time, by the time we get to a potential surprise, that's either alleviated or very well known to the candidate. Now, of course, we can't predict and sometimes reveal all of the surprises that will happen, right? We're all currently going through a pandemic, and there's probably not many of us who could have predicted that. But what we can do is actually question for ourselves in the start of the hiring process, where are we as an institution? How do we communicate effectively, not only the opportunities of this position, but the challenges and the potential surprises of this position? And all it's doing, right, for I think all of us in this space, is just asking us to think one step deeper and one step closer around what it is going to take to retain and to recruit and retain candidates towards the end. So even to Kelvin's point about thinking about the end in mind, thinking about the process in mind, and thinking about where does that start for me as a hiring manager, questions for this candidate, but also for questions for me in the organization. I do also want to lift up in the chat as well that there are very practical questions about, who is on the hiring committee, what is the information, that we're putting out for candidates. And also want to lift up what Leslie Ray said at the very end about how to operationalize transparency. And that's such a big key in terms of even asking yourself, how are we defining it for our organization, and what are ways that it operationalizes itself? Are we clear with our staffs about what the decisions that leadership is considering and the timeline of those decisions? Are we clear about the organizational hierarchy for everyone and where this person fits in the hiring of this? But that operationalization piece is so key, not only in terms of the actual search process, but it is the setup. It is the appetizer before you actually go out and are trying to bring people into the organization.
Yeah, thanks, Al. And I think that is true also because I think it's very difficult to be transparent with someone who is coming into the organization if you're not already transparent with people within the organization, because then you risk them knowing things that like the organization itself doesn't know. And so I think that it becomes an operational, like you have to think about it in terms of the entire structure, and you have to think about it in terms of culture, right? I think that when we talk about transparency, it's not necessarily all about processes and procedures. Don't get me wrong, I think those are very important, but I think it is also a cultural issue that we're trying to undo, which has to do with a culture of secrecy and power hoarding. Information is power. And I also want to lift up what Claudia said in the chat, which is that there's a tension between Claudia Alec, there's a tension between transparency and narrative, who shapes and pushes the story. And I just wanted to say that I think that that's why it's so important to consider who it is the candidates are speaking to, and is that a diverse group of people? Are they getting a wide swath of experiences at this organization? Because I think that there is one narrative that's put like in the job description, and there's another narrative that each individual has, and trying to give each candidate as broad of a range, even if those some parts of that range might make you a little bit nervous. I think it is in the benefit of the organization and the candidate that you're hiring that you allow people who have a very varied experiences within an organization to speak to the candidate and to be a part of the hiring process for really any position. And so I think that that leads us well into our next prompt. And so now that you've worked on a definition for yourself, one of the things that a lot of these that these searches require is for people to come together around some kind of idea of transparency and some sort of basic understanding of what transparency looks like. So what we'll invite you to do is we're going to set up some breakout groups for each of you. I think it'll be about 7 or 8 people per breakout group. And what we'd like you to do is share your working definition of transparency with the group as a jumping off point for y'all to brainstorm 5 to 10 processes and or procedures that the industry would have to adopt in order to be seen as a leader in transparent hiring by other industries. So the world that we're inviting you to imagine together and with us is what does it look like if the theater wanted to put all of its effort into becoming a like international leader on what equitable and transparent hiring practices look like? What are 5 to 10 things that they would have to adopt in order to make that true? And trying to listen really deeply to what other people in your group are saying is transparency to them, and trying to come up with 5 or 10 things that sort of accommodate as many of those definitions as possible. And then we'll come back and we will share what some of those might be and what some of us might be able to commit to as we go back into these search processes.
Mm-hmm. I just want to jump in too to say as another framing of considering, we've all been shared on and know, hopefully quite a bit about some of the different tenets of white supremacy culture that we have all circulated and have tend to find. And to consider that in your conversation too around transparency. What are ways that we can undo some of these tenets as a way to getting towards transparency and greater transparency within the field? And the only other piece I would add is that as you're going through, if you have someone who can take some notes, we may not ask all breakout groups to share their pieces, but we want to hear from as many as we can. So if someone can take notes as we're coming back for a more facilitated conversation, we'll ask for people to share out where they can around some of those processes. And with that, Shauna and/or I can't remember the other.
Natalie.
Madeline, thank you. If you want to work and give us some instructions on the breakout groups, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you just remind me how long we want to spend in these spaces?
Sure, about 20 minutes, ultimately 25 minutes. But given the time, I would say 20 minutes.
Okay, great. So with that, I'll just say, folks, a reminder that the recording will be paused while you're in the breakout rooms. So that's not something that you need to to consider your words under. And also, if for whatever reason you'd like to be placed in a different breakout room, please feel free to just exit into the main space and I'd be happy to move you into a different room. And with that, you will be zoomed off in just a moment. Actually, before I do that, I just want to lift up Kelvin's question in the chat as to whether we have any group agreements going into these spaces. I will take a moment and just share the community agreements we have for the fall forum in the chat, but I'll also invite our facilitators up. Thanks, Devin. If there's anything else we want to add.
I think in particular, understanding not only, with these group agreements, but also, as we are in these situations, to allow people to speak from their experiences, whether you are, a white ally or if you are BIPOC, and to really allow for those BIPOC voices to enter into the space and enter into from their experiences. Understanding that where privilege operates both in the hiring process, within the roles that you all have as people who are hiring managers or supervising other hiring managers, that dynamics exists in those spaces as well. So let's acknowledge that power dynamic, but also acknowledge, more clearly the experiences of BIPOC folks in these spaces and allowing those experiences to be lifted up, but also honored for what that experience is and how it is shared in the room in particular.
Yeah, and I would say that we're not here to debate whether someone's idea is or is not transparent. Right. I think that one of the things that we are really looking for in this session is an ideation more and having as many ideas as possible. So we really aren't here to debate whether someone's idea of transparency is right or wrong and or what their suggestions might be, but just to brainstorm together and come to some procedures and processes that might work for more people.
Brilliant, thank you. And with that, I will go ahead and open the rooms.
And that there is a tension. I think, frankly, there's always a tension around money. There's a tension around naming and locking yourself into a particular range or, a particular sector of people, who you figure may or may not be interested in the role based on that. So that absolutely is a challenge. And I have thoughts on that, but I will share them later. Other takeaways from folks, whether it is about processes within the organization, we've heard about salary transparency. We've also heard about where we post different positions. What else is coming up for folks if someone wants to volunteer?
I can jump in with a question that came up and persists. My name's Alan. And that is, as we codify trying to be transparent, how do you put quantity on the connections that people bring, whether it be playwrights or other directors that they know that certain people might bring and certain others might not? What's a way to quantify that so it's done ahead of time as opposed to maybe in retrospect?
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. And again, I always have thoughts and opinions, but I will just leave that question out there for the moment, because I think it is a key question about what is that either quantifying or measuring process for us at the beginning and at the top of many searches. And how do we bring in, of course, again, networks that we know, folks that we do know, and also folks, again, that we do not yet know, and how we are getting to know them within the organization or through a search apparatus. I want to lift up Claudia's pieces or a few pieces within the chat as well, in particular Claudia's question about how to not overburden that BIPOC person. They were talking about a BIPOC member of an EDI from the EDI committee being involved in the search, and how to not overburden that person. That we want people to be able to be involved as much as possible, but in particular, there does tend to be a tendency of, we want more BIPOC people, so the BIPOC person has to do a good bit of the work. I thought someone was starting to speak as I did. But
that was Claudia. I was just going to jump in and say I feel comfortable.
Go for it, Claudia, please.
Voicing it just a bit. So it was a story of success that was being shared, having more diverse hiring committees and having better results because of that. But then another person brought up the incredibly important question of hierarchically, where are those people positioned inside the organization? What are their already existent job duties? And is it reasonable to expect them to do additional labor? Are they being compensated for it? And then we had another conversation about how in this particular instance, hourly employees were actually being given the additional time to do the time. So they were able to maintain their 40-hour work week. Check.
Thank you, Claudia. I also appreciate you not only putting it in the chat, but again, also explicating it. And a great way of thinking about success, as well as not only transparency, but again, equity. How are we also compensating, acknowledging, rewarding and or allowing people into the process, in particular BIPOC folks, but also where that can be successful in terms of drawing out the thinking and drawing out different perspectives, especially as candidates are going through the process.
Yeah, Alan, one of the things that came up for the group that I was in is the importance of time, of how quickly we feel the need to, or we feel the impulse to go through these searches, because there's a job to be done and no one's sitting in that position necessarily, but that in order to ensure transparency and that we need to allow ourselves the time to go through the process of making sure that we're getting the stakeholders' input in before we do that, before we start the search, and getting as many different diverse perspectives, so that transparency and equity just will take more time, and building that time into the process and into our expectations is also something we're going to have to do as we shift.
Thank you for that, Leandro. I also want to, uplift again, continuing looking at the chat too. In particular, Mark talking about clear communication of institutional, cultural, turning resumes into holistic bio narratives, and time for candidates to express who their best selves are. And even jumping down to Blake's point, also about where and how candidates have their own concerns addressed from the outset of the process. Blake, I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to go over to Kelvin as well.
You know what, Al, I'm going to defer to Kelvin because it was Kelvin's comment. I was simply reporting it out in the chat, so he should speak for himself.
Excellent. Sounds good. Kelvin?
Thank you, Blake. Thanks, Al. Just one of the things that I wanted to share is one with that comment and sharing it with the group. It's talking about the many tiers of engagement a candidate has before they get to the institution, and what is clear from, or what is transparent rather, in a job description, what's transparent when you are being recruited by a member of that organization, what's transparent when a search firm is reaching out to you, right? Those are 3 tiers of engagement in the process, and that offer opportunities for transparency. So a candidate's orientation to that work and their concerns being addressed before they even enter the search process, right? That is a tier of engagement that, that you, in executive searches, you work out at some point. But those questions, again, being sort of the things that are going to allow you to step into the process or not, and whether or not your needs will be met throughout the search process. But what I was raising my hand to share was also about this idea of feedback and where it belongs in a search process, right? That there's feedback to be given about the search committee and the search process, as well as about the individuals involved in that process, and the feedback for the search firm that has been engaged to do that process, right? And right now, I'm not sure where that feedback loop protects the candidate, who will either have to think about, why not they were hired from the search committee standpoint, but also having a continuing and ongoing relationship with an executive search firm, and how that feedback is given in a way that protects the integrity of who they are and how they go through a process. So that was one of the things that's still open.
Absolutely. And Kelvin, I appreciate you bringing that up around that tiers of feedback piece, because even for us in working with organization as well as working with candidates, part of what I do tell people frankly is that I'm going to keep it real with you. If Dave Chappelle's segment when keeping it real goes wrong, like that is me on steroids, because what I will not do, and what I have always seen, and I think we know this as theater practitioners, right? That, there are times we do want to soften the blow, that we want to be kind, we want to give good feedback. My role as a recruiter is to be like, I'm going to keep it real with you. I'm going to keep it real not only with the candidates, but also with the board as well as the staff about, here is where, in particular, when Leandro and Jocelyn and I do stakeholder interviews, here's what we hear from BIPOC folks in the community. Here's what you need to know as a staff and as a board in terms of how you're perceived by people of color. And that is an important piece of transparency as well. It's not to say that others don't do that. That's not the idea. I'm telling you that what I do and what we try to do is to give a very reflective process to say, here's what we have heard in order to provide information for the staff and board, but also to hear it and be able to representative not only of the organization's concerns, but the community's larger concerns that these candidates will have to inherently engage with as well. Other thoughts? We've got about 7 minutes left before we're hopping off our time together, but want to uplift other thoughts or responses from folks that are in the chat, but also some pieces that we have heard, or also some other aspects of searches that we have not heard.
Oh, can I share?
Go ahead, Leslie.
Oh,
right?
sorry.
Absolutely.
This is just I think it's a success, and it's an event that occurred at our theater where there had been an episode of racial harm that had occurred, and staff and the executive leadership team on staff had a series of an outside consulting firm do a assessment and an anonymous interview process and really dive into what happened, who was harmed, and what action was going to take place as a result of that. Well, all of that was taking place within the staff and within the leadership and within former folks who had worked at the theater in the past. And what I want to share is at the 11th hour, our managing director and artistic director sort of said, we would like to bring our board chair and governance chair into this conversation at this time. So we had the opportunity to hear sort of the full story and then work together to bring that out in a way that honored and respected all of the different levels of relationship that the broader trustee and audience and engagement community had with the theater. And I just feel like that was a game changer for all of us, and a profound act of transparency and honesty from our leadership to share with us, that we could all gather and think about how to share candidly and authentically with the much broader community. And it's been a big turning point, and I think an exciting one after several years of trying to quote figure out how to do this work.
That's a great success story, in particular. Thank you for that. Again, all about finding how do you bring in and find as many different perspectives and many different angles as we possibly can. Now, we all recognize, right, there's limited time, there's limited resources, there's limited moments. But part of the transparency piece and part of even working against white supremacy culture is how do we slow all of that down for us, especially in a field and in an industry where, frankly, we're trying to get to the next opening night all the time. Well, now that is mitigated in many ways. So how do we use that time to also think deeply and clearly as well, and to get clear perspectives, both for the community, the organization, as well as the candidate? I want to, before we wrap up, just quickly go back towards Alan's question about codifying and quantitating the value of connections that candidates can have. I think there it is, yes, it can be codifying and quantitating, but I think it's more, to me, asking yourself within that search, what is that value? What kind of value do we place upon connections, and why? What is that piece and importance for the organization that you either quantitate, because within the organization there is a tangible manifestation of those connections, whether it is engaging artists in a new play lab, or whether it is working, of course, with different theater artisans from across the country, but also to consider what are ways that we look at quantitating and codifying those connections, whether it is numerically, but also the value for the organization itself. How do you see that manifesting within your theater and the importance within that and within the theater? And then being able to apply it upon candidates, but don't let that be the only factor and the only piece that allows you to either say yay or nay to a candidate. People may have connections that are just as valuable that, again, we don't know about, or that candidate may be able to bring in terms of a new lifeblood for that organization. But I would start with first naming what are the ways that those connections manifest themselves? How often does that manifest numerically? And is there a way to measure that against candidates or not? While also leaving your biases open, that's not the only way to, the number that a person knows, or number of people that a person knows, is not the only way to quantify what those valued connections are to that candidate and for that. I know that there is so much more to discuss, and deeply appreciate everybody coming into this work and coming into this space, to begin to answer a question that has many different tentacles to it. I want to leave you and Leandro and I with just a couple of different takeaways that I'm going to pop into the chat in a second. But in particular, want to thank everybody for their time and for their role in trying to imagine a more transparent hiring process and a more transparent field. And while I'm putting that in the chat, I'll leave it with Leandro as well to give some closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us on this conversation. It's been a really great discussion. And I just want to also encourage y'all, if you want more information, you feel like you want more of a workshop on this, I would encourage you to sign up for the Finding the Keys workshop that is led by Sharifa Joka by Art Equity, and that is happening. We'll drop the link to that in the chat as well. And so that if you want a very specific methodology that she's created about how to have inclusive and transparent hiring, that is a great resource to join. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us and for contributing to our fantastic conversation.
Yep, Natalie, and I don't know if there's a way to also send out those at the chat, but I just posted them in the chat if folks want to copy and paste them.
Yeah, that's perfect. And thank you, Al and Leandro, for leading this wonderful session. Really appreciate it. I do want to encourage folks to continue this conversation in Mighty Networks, specifically any of those really tangible points that you were discussing in the breakout rooms. I would love to get a thread going with people just sharing out those thoughts and those notes. And I will leave you with that as we head into our final session of the day. Thank you so much for joining us, for connecting with TCG. Really encourage you to stay plugged in to the rest of the week and consider supporting TCG as you can. And with that, I will go ahead and close us out. Thank you all.
Thank you all.